basically largest trading barriers in a generation and maybe several generations for all the goods shipped from the EU going into the United States now facing a tariff of 20%. Tom, right now, beginning right now, all of that sort of pricing, that 20% is working its way through the producers, working its way through the consumers, working its way through all of these businesses to try to figure out where all of this pricing is going to finally rest. And for the Europeans, their determination now is to figure out how to respond to this. What we expect to get from the Europeans now and what we expect to get today is the retaliatory measures, not to the tariffs that just went into effect, but the retaliatory tariffs to the steel and aluminum tariffs that came into effect a couple of weeks ago. What we will get today from the EU, we are hoping to get, is the list of goods that will be targeted by the Europeans. We should say, Tom, this will be a fairly modest list. This will only affect about $20 billion worth of goods in a relationship that's worth $1 trillion. And that is deliberate, Tom, because the Europeans are still holding out hope that they can negotiate a deal with Donald Trump. But then things get really more interesting, Tom, is next week when we get that broader list. And this is going to be the list of retaliatory tariffs to the 20% that we got overnight. And Tom, this is the sort of mother lode from the European Union. This is where they will begin to think about targeting U.S. tech companies, U.S. services, and really expanding that out of just a sort of narrow lane of goods. And that is going to be the conversation that goes on next week. If they cannot negotiate a solution, we should say, Tom, and we should continue to reiterate that the Europeans, there is no one in Europe that does not want to negotiate a solution. However, the Trump administration does not seem terribly inclined at this stage to even talk to the Europeans about this.
Yeah, we had a reminder of that yesterday, didn't we, with President Trump giving the EU another characteristic tongue lashing. So how likely is a deal going forward, given where the president stands around his animus towards the EU?
Yeah, Tom, I think it's very, very hard to say. I think that right now I can't say there's a huge amount of optimism. As we were reporting earlier in the week, the trade ministers here in Europe are preparing Plan A. Plan A was negotiation, and Plan B is retaliation. In terms of the probabilities, you know, they wouldn't really give me one, but I think that increasingly Plan B looks more and more certain. That being said, Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, will be heading to Washington, D.C. next week. She'll be meeting with Donald Trump. She will be trying to do the diplomatic effort. She is there to represent the EU in a certain sense, to try to get some concessions, to try to advance the conversation on tariffs. That being said, if the conversations with Benjamin Netanyahu, a very strong ally of the United States, are anything to go by, that may be a tougher conversation than anticipated. That being said, Tom, I think we should also say that Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, right now is in Vietnam. He touches down in Beijing on Friday. Pedro Sanchez has talked for a very long time about maybe a closer relationship with China, and maybe in the context of what's going on with the United States, trying to rethink the policy towards China and really trying to establish China as a more stable partner. That is what the Chinese are trying to say, saying that they're a more reliable partner now than the United States. That being said, all of the trade ministers I spoke to earlier in the week are not at this stage really willing or having any inclination to have a sort of major rethink of the relationship with China. But Tom, as this goes on to royal markets and the United States' position becomes clearer and clearer, it is not completely out of the question for the Europeans to start thinking about this.